Hi and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today I'd like to help you understand the Combine framework and show you how you can use it in a UIKit app. We are going to build some examples that use the Combine framework for different purposes, like connecting a switch and a button and sending some messages within our app. Before we do that, you're going to learn what the Combine framework is and how it works, also with some basic examples in a playground. And if that sounds good, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to not miss any future videos. So now, let's get started. So before we work with the Combine framework in practice, let's see what it is and how it works in theory. So the Combine framework is a declarative Swift API for processing values over time. We're going to focus on the processing values over time in a second. Let's first of all have a look at what declarative really means. So to better understand what declarative means and what declarative coding is, let's compare it to imperative programming. These are actually two mental models. Imperative programming is much more of a how something works and a mental model that is much closer to how a computer works. And declarative programming is much more tailored to how humans think, and we're describing what we actually want. Let's also have another example, maybe for a recipe for mashed potatoes. So in an imperative way, what we would do is to give a very detailed instruction of how mashed potatoes are made. So first we peel the potatoes, then we cook the potatoes, then we mash the potatoes, and then we add butter and maybe also nutmeg. So this is the imperative way of doing things. So in a declarative way, what we would do is maybe asking a chef, please make mashed potatoes. And the chef says, okay, here you are. And in other terms, that means that rather than potentially implementing multiple delegate callbacks or completion handler closures, you can create a single processing chain for a given event source. To clear this up, let's say you used your cool radio with a display to subscribe to a great radio weather service, and there is naturally this amazing publisher that delivers great weather data. So what you really need to do is to attach your radio, the subscriber, to the publisher you are interested in. And your subscriber has to tell the publisher that it wants to receive values, in our case weather data, over time. Very important to remember here is that the publisher only emits values when explicitly requested to do so by a subscriber like your radio. Once a subscriber receives an element, it can act on it. In our case, for example, display the weather data in its display. But there's a problem. It doesn't really fit into the display. That's not really cool. But fortunately, there are tools that can help us modify data. Let's say just remove this icon. And our temperature value now fits nicely into the screen of our radio. Now, in terms of the Combine framework, tools like this hammer could be called operators. And they can act on the values received from upstream publishers and republish them in a form that fits your needs. So publishers, subscribers, and operators, these are the building blocks of Combine. And to better understand these building blocks or key concepts, let's have a look at them in detail one more time. So first of all, the publisher. The publisher defines how values and errors are produced. There are structs, so value types, and they allow registration of one subscriber. The subscriber receives values and potentially a completion, their reference types, and an operator also adopts publisher. It describes a behavior for changing values, and they subscribe to a publisher, which is called an upstream. They send results down to a subscriber, which is called a downstream, and there are also value types like a publisher. Now, the relationship between a publisher and a subscriber is something that we need to discuss in a little more detail. So we have to look at the input and output types. As you can see in this example or in the definition of the subscriber and publisher protocols, we have for the subscriber an input type, for the publisher an output type. And for both of them to communicate, we need to make sure that the input type and output type really match. Same is true for the failure type. So in order to make this happen, we can use operators. We're going to see that in practice in a second. But let's first of all have a look at some special subscribers that really take this burden from us, because there are two special subscribers. The first one is called sync. Sync takes two closures. The first closure executes when it receives subscribers completion, which is an enumeration that indicates whether the publisher finished normally or failed with an error. The second closure executes when it receives an element from the publisher. For example, you can use the sync subscriber to log when the publisher completes and each time it receives an element. The second special subscriber is called assign, and it immediately assigns every element it receives to a property of a given object using a key path to indicate the property. Both the sync and assign subscribers request an unlimited number of elements for their publishers, and we are going to see both of these subscribers in action in a second. So to help you better understand what you've just seen, I'd like to illustrate things with a simple playground. So here in this playground, I've just imported Foundation and Combine, and I've also already added some code for a weather publisher to send some temperatures to 10, 20, 24, and so on degrees C. And we want to get notified as soon as we have a notification that informs us about a temperature of more than 25 degrees C, because then it's a summer day, and this is something that we're interested in. Now, to get started, let's create our weather publisher. And I'm going to use a pass-through subject here. This is also technically called a publisher because it publishes announcements of changes to the world. And I have to specify two things, a type and an error type. And here I could just use error. I could also use never, which means I will never throw errors. This is also possible. It would also be possible to give no type at all here, so we could use void. This is interesting for some scenarios in Swift UI, for example, but we're going to go with an integer here because our temperatures are just integers. And for the error, we could also use a custom type. Let's call this weather error, and this is of type error. And here, one case could be things just happen. So this is going to be our weather error that we are going to use for our publisher. So this is the publisher. Now let's attach it to a subscriber, and I'm just going to assign our weather publisher right here. And now, as I said, we're just interested to get notified when we receive temperatures that are above 25 degrees. So I can use an operator here, just filter, so very simple, and I can just use each element that we receive and check if it is greater than 25. And if that is the case, then I'd like to print a summer day of let's say 26 degrees Celsius. So to do that, I can use the sync operator, which automatically also matches the output and failure types of the attached publisher. So here we have the sync operator. And in our closure, we're going to get a value that we can now use. So we can print, for example, a summer day of a specific degrees Celsius value. And now let's see what happens if we let our weather publisher send some pieces of data. And as you can see, we will only receive the values that are over 25 degrees Celsius. So we get 26, 28, and 30. And if I were to use my weather publisher again and send not a completion, but another value of, let's say, 18 degrees, then we will not receive this message because our filter condition is not matched. So this is how we can work with publishers, subscribers, and operators. And I'd like to give you a quick example of what we can also do. Here I have just pasted another subscriber. We're also attaching our weather publisher, and we'd like to handle the different events. So we receive a subscription. This subscription can be used now in our closure. So we'll get notified about a new subscription. We will get notified about receiving an output, receiving completion, receiving a cancel, and also print something when we receive a value. So let's run this one more time, maybe here on the bottom. And as you can see, once we actually subscribe to our publisher in with another subscriber, we get the message, we have a new subscription to our pass-through subject. Then we receive an output, which is our output of 10 degrees, 20 degrees, and so on. Then we will also get the value of subscriber received a value of 10 degrees, for example, and we do not really see our completion, and that failed, for example, with an error. And this is because there was no error, but we could send one. So let's maybe just use our weather publisher here at the bottom one more time, and this time we send a completion. We use subscribers and completion and pass along the type of our error that we want to send. This is going to be our weather error. And this is going to be a failure, and the reason is things just happen. And if we now let this run again, then you will see that we stop the whole thing when we send actually the 30 degrees. This is the last thing that we see. And then our last output is subscription completed with a potential error, and this is the error things just happen, which is what we get from our receive completion right here. And now, after all this groundwork, let's move one step further to using all of that in UIKit. And for that purpose, I have created a very simple single view application, not using Swift UI, just using plain old UIKit with a storyboard, a ViewController, and so on. And the purpose of this application is that we can turn on this switch, which will also enable our send message button. So when we allow messages, then we can send a message, and then we will also, when we press this button, we will see a new message here in this label. So nothing fancy really, but we will just use the combined framework for this to work. And we're going to start in our ViewController. I have already created outlets for our switch, for the send button, and for the message label. And now what we need first is actually a publisher that we can use if we are allowed to actually send messages. And for that, we can use a property wrapper called published. And before we can use that, we should import combine. So now we have the combined framework available and also the published property wrapper. If you'd like to know more about property wrappers, go ahead and have a look at my latest video on Swift UI. There you will find a detailed explanation of what property wrappers are. And what I'd like to do here is just create a property called can send messages, which is just a bool, and we're setting this to false. And with this property wrapper published, we can actually add a publisher to this property. And what we'll also need, and let's maybe create that as a private property here, let's call it switch subscriber, and this is going to be of type any cancelable, and there's going to be optional. And this type any cancelable helps us with memory management, since, for example, our Swift comes with a dispose bag and combines comes with this type any cancelable, and this class calls cancel when our ViewController is deinitialized and makes sure subscriptions are terminated early. So with this ready, we can start creating maybe a function. Let's call it setup processing chain, and we're going to call this in view.load. So let's say setup processing chain right here. And now we can connect our subscriber with a publisher, and we have this switch subscriber, and we want to connect it with our can send messages publisher. And to actually get access to the receive function of this publisher, we have to use the $sign to actually get access to the property or the function from the property wrapper. So we use can send messages, and we want to receive elements from the publisher on the main thread. So let's use dispatch queue. And use the dispatch queue main. And with that, we can assign a specific key path on our button. So we want to use the key path is enabled to actually enable our send button. So we receive messages, or we receive elements from our can send messages publisher on the main thread, and we assign it to the send button and its is enabled property using this key path is enabled. And with that, our publisher and subscriber are connected to each other, and we also have two IB actions for the switch and for the send message button. And for the switch, what we have to do now is change our can send messages Boolean to the current state of our switch. So here I'm just going to use the sender, which we have as a parameter here in the didSwitch function, and using the isOn property. And with that, we always set the bool correctly. So when our switch is turned on, we set this to true. If it's off, we set this to false, and we will immediately notify our button to be actually enabled. And as you can see, currently the button is disabled. So let's run this in the simulator and see if we can actually turn on our button by turning on this switch. So here in the simulator, if I now activate my switch, I also activate our send message button, and we can actually now handle sending messages next. So a very easy way to connect these two elements, UI elements, with each other using combine. And now for our messages, we again want to use a publisher and a subscriber. Maybe set this up also in setup processing chain, and we're going to have a message publisher first. So let's name this message publisher. And in this case, we're going to use a notification center publisher. And if you have worked with the notification center before, then you will feel that this is pretty familiar with things you've done earlier. So we're going to use publisher here. And we can initialize this with the default center and a notification name. So we can use default here and notification name, let's say notification name, and this is going to be new message. So this is one way of defining a notification name. Another way would be to create an extension on the notification name. Therefore, let's scroll up a little bit. We will just do everything right here in one file so that it is not too confusing. And I'm going to create an extension here on notification.name. And then we'll have a static constant called, let's say, new message. And this is going to receive the notification name, new message. All right. And with this extension, what we can do is simply pass along a simple name, which is new message, and with that, preventing any typos from our notification to be called or using it properly. And now with our publisher ready, we can actually create our message subscriber. So let's create a message subscriber, and we're using subscribers here. Use assign to create a new subscriber for our object message label and the key path text. So we're actually talking to the text property of our message label. And now we can actually connect our publisher to our subscriber using the message publisher and subscribe using the message subscriber. And there we have it. Let's quickly build that, and let's find out that we get these two errors telling us that the instant method subscribe requires the types publisher output, aka notification, and string be equivalent. And this is what I've told you earlier. Output and input types have to match. Earlier, when we dealt with the can send messages publisher, we have used the assign operator. And as you remember, the assign and the sync operator both handle the usage of the same input and output types automatically. But what can we do if we do not use this assign operator? Well, we can use the map operator, but we're going to do this in a second. First of all, since we're dealing with messages here, I might want to create my own type for that. So right on top of our ViewController class and below the extension for our notification name, let me create a quick struct here. Let's call it message. Giving it two properties. Let's say we have the content, which is a string, and we're going to have an author, also a string. So just that we have a type and that we know what we can work with. And when do we actually want to send a message? Well, when we press our button. So let's maybe use our button function, our IB action send messages, or send message first, to create a message. Let's initialize that with a message, not with message label, but with a message, and the content, the current time is, just pass along a date object, and the author is me. So with that, we have a message that we can send, and then to actually send the message, we use the notification center, default, and then we can just post our message using a notification name and an object. And for the notification name, we've already created that. That would be new message. And the object that we'd like to pass along is the message that we've just created before. So now let's deal with connecting our message publisher to the message subscriber properly using an operator to make the input and output types match. So I'm going to use the map operator right here. And as you can see, currently we're receiving a notification because we're using the notification center publisher. And what we can do now is taking this notification here as a parameter and returning an optional string, just as we're required to do. And then we can just return our notification. In this notification, we have an object. This is the object that we're passing along here when we're posting the notification in send button. And then we can just cast this object to a message object. And in this message object, we have the content, and this is a string. And if this does not work, then we will simply return an empty string. And if we build this one more time, our error disappeared, the types are matching, and we have successfully used our map operator for returning the proper type. So we're having our message publisher, we have connected it to our message subscriber, and now we can run this in the simulator and see if we can indeed send some messages. I cannot send messages yet because my button is turned off, so let's turn it on and send a message. And there we have it. As you can see, every time I press the button, I'm sending a new message, indicated by this second counter here, and this works really fine. So this was a very quick example of how you can use the combined framework together with UIKit. You've seen the theory, you've seen it in practice. I hope you enjoyed this. If so, give this video a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe to not miss any future tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!